Benchmade's Axis Assist mechanism, most notably featured in their award-winning Barrage line of knives, is perhaps one of the most popular and most powerful assisted opening technologies available to knife consumers. Its unique design is a testament to Benchmade engineers' ingenuity and is one of the few designs that spurns the torsion bar for the superior power of the coil spring. In fact, the Axis Assist is the direct descendant of a coil spring-based automatic mechanism that Benchmade uses in many of its automatic models. Thus, to understand the function of the Axis Assist, it's instructive to first study the behavior of this parent mechanism, known as the auto axis. When closing the blade of an automatic knife which utilizes the auto axis opening mechanism, one winds a coil spring which resides in the hub of the knife. Once the blade is closed, the omega springs of the axis lock force a metal bar into a slot at the bottom of the blade, securing it in the closed position. The key point to appreciate is that the blade is always, at every point along its path, acted upon by the force of the coil spring. The potential energy stored by the winding of the spring is held in check by the axis lock bar, which physically obstructs the blade from opening. Only once the lock bar is pulled clear of the lock bar slot is this energy released and the blade propelled forward. By modifying the way the coil spring fits into the blade hub and adding a specially designed spring housing, Benchmade devised a clever method to control when and where the coil spring force is applied to the blade. In doing so, they transformed their automatic design into an assisted opening one and called it the Axis Assist. Closing the blade of an assisted opening knife featuring the Axis Assist mechanism also winds a coil spring, inputting energy that will later drive the blade open. However, there is a key difference relative to the auto axis mechanism's behavior. There exists a point along the closing path at which the coil spring force acting upon the blade is transferred from the blade to the coil spring housing. Once closed beyond this transfer point, the blade is completely free from coil spring force. Note that the blade retention in the handle is governed by the axis lock. The energy captured by the spring housing is released back to the blade once the blade is manually pushed to the transfer point by the user's finger, snapping the blade open. Thus, the crucial difference between the automatic design and the assisted design lies in which part of the knife bears the responsibility for holding the spring energy in check. In the auto axis, it is the axis lock bar. In the Axis Assist, it is the coil spring housing. Since the Barrage was introduced to market, it's clear that a peculiar feature of the Axis Assist mechanism has caused a good deal of consternation amongst many of those who have purchased the model, leading many to believe that the mechanism is prone to malfunction. The issue concerns the essential requirement that the coil spring is properly set during assembly of the knife. When the coil spring is not properly set, the Axis Assist mechanism will no longer behave as designed. This defective behavior can be recreated by loosening the pivot screw, which introduces a small amount of play under the coil spring housing. Since it is the bottom rim of this housing which holds the coil spring tab in its channel within the blade hub, the introduction of play allows the tab to pop out of position once the blade starts to move. With the spring tab displaced, the keystone function of the Axis Assist mechanism is undermined. The force of the coil spring can no longer be transferred from the blade to the spring housing, resulting in poor blade retention since the omega springs are not strong enough to fully counter the coil spring. As in the case of the auto axis mechanism, the blade is now under coil spring force at all points along its path. In addition, since the spring tab has been displaced further clockwise in the direction of unwinding, there is less winding of the spring when the blade is closed, resulting in a loss of opening power. Fortunately, this problem is easily rectified. The coil spring can be reset by pulling the blade back beyond the vertical enough to align the coil spring tab with its conjugate slot in the blade hub. To do this, first slide the axis lock bar out of position and remove the thumb studs. Next, remove the blade stop assembly, which consists of two parts, a blade stop pin and a blade stop pin sleeve. Verify that the pivot screw is sufficiently loosened, and while applying pressure to the spring housing, pull the blade backward until the spring tab clicks into its conjugate slot. Moving the blade forward again while releasing the pressure will pop the tab back out. Observe that when the tab is properly set in its slot, the coil spring housing is flush to the steel liner. When the tab is displaced, a small gap is obvious. Once the tab is properly seated in its conjugate slot, it is important to remember to keep the pressure applied to the spring housing until the pivot screw has been retightened enough to eliminate play. With the axis bar slid back into position, check the blade retention and verify that the spring housing is flush to the liner. The coil spring is now reset and the axis assist mechanism should function normally.